All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Michelle Prose, Senior Instructor in the Department of English. Michelle holds a Master's of English with an emphasis in Rhetoric and Composition from Colorado State University, Pueblo, and is one class away from completing a Master of Business Administration with an emphasis in Operations Management from UCCS. She has taught first-year Rhetoric and Writing at UCCS since the fall of 2016. And has taught ENGL 1300, 1305, 1308, 1310, and 1410 in that time, along with occasional GPS classes. Her hobbies include hiking, leisurely reading novels, and spending time with her husband, Tom. And congratulations are in order because they are expecting their first child together in June.
Thank you, Melissa. I included that note about being pregnant so you guys aren't like, wow, thanks for getting dressed up for the occasion. Got my UCCS gear on, but nothing fits right now. So thank you. Thank you for ignoring that. Again, thank you for all of you that are here in person today. Thank you so much for everybody that's here online. Today, we are here to talk about ethics in their combination with research writing, with stasis theory. And unplanned, when I originally signed up to be a fellow, we're also going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and some of the ways that that is changing the landscape when it comes to academic writing. And exciting, I just taught this class yesterday, so I have a lot of fresh ideas that I want to share with you guys today. So the biggest challenge will be holding myself to only talk about that for a little while so we can get to the research writing and the stasis theory. Welcome. For those of you who are here in person, I've been to these before. And I've always been really hesitant to get up and get seconds or refills because I didn't want to disturb the person presenting. Eat, drink, don't worry about me. For those of you online, refill your coffee, refill your tea. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I want to start with some brief acknowledgements because this presentation today would not have been possible without 3 people. And then we're going to talk about, I'm going to have you do a very brief group reflection since we've lost a little bit of time, and I will probably cut down the amount of sharing out time just to make sure I can get through all my slides. And then after that, I've broken this presentation down into 3 phases. And I've done that because I believe that students have a better opportunity to really consume the DFEI principles if they are introduced to them multiple times throughout a semester. So we'll start by phase 1, which happens very early in the semester, aka yesterday. Phase 2, which will show up in about March, and then phase 3, which will happen throughout the semester, but mostly in the second half of the class. And then I have a request for feedback at the end. I attended a roundtable hosted by Karen Larkin last year, who, by the way, it was stellar. Why she was asking for feedback, I don't understand, but it was a work in progress. It was something she hadn't presented yet. So phase 1, complete, but phase 2 and phase 3 are still in the works. So any feedback that you have on those 2, I would greatly appreciate those at the end. So there are 3 people that I need to thank before I can really jump into this presentation. The first is in control of our slides, Tracy Gonzalez. I've known Tracy since 2018. Being a part of the DFEI program has been incredible. The fact that it exists on campus, that it exists as successfully as it does, it's exciting to be a part of. It's exciting to get to talk to my colleagues about the things that I'm doing within it. So thank you, Tracy, for all of the hard work that you put into making this program one of the top programs in the state of Colorado. My second thank you is to Dr. Ann Imakuchi, who is here today. Ann's been my boss for 7.5 years. And when I started at UCCS, I was like, imposter syndrome had consumed me. I seriously thought I had duped the hiring committee and tricked them into believing that I belonged here. And over the last 7.5 years, she has supported me and empowered me and encouraged me. So there's no way I would confidently stand here before you today if she had not been a part of that for the last 7.5 years. My third thank you is to Andrea Winker, who is probably surprised to be getting a shout out right now, but she is here digitally with us today. Andrea is a brilliant rhetorician, an incredible colleague, and she is the author of the chapter in our textbook on the 3rd level of stasis, which is what I'm going to be talking about most today. And for all of our students who are unfortunate enough not to get to take her classes, they do benefit from having read this chapter in the textbook. And it makes teaching this level of stasis so much easier because of the way she wrote that chapter. I've cited her several times in this presentation. So a huge thank you to Andrea just for being this incredible asset to her colleagues and to her students. Okay, so I wanted to start with a brief reflection, and we'll make it especially brief now, You might think of this as an opportunity to write kind of stream of consciousness. You might think about making a list of words or key phrases that come up when you think about these things. But I've asked you to think about two questions. The first is I want you to think about the relationship between research writing and ethics. What do these two concepts mean to each other? How do they influence each other? And then as mostly educators of research writing and ethics, Chase, you are welcome to think about this through the student perspective. What are you most concerned about when it comes to the relationship between these two things as you go on to teach your students how to value the process, how to value the final product, and the decisions that have to be made while doing both of those things? Committing to the process of research writing while also committing to principles and characteristics of ethics. Would anyone be willing to share maybe some ideas, some words, some phrases that came up? I'm not going to bother sharing the mic for the sake of time. Thank you, Monica.
We just talked about this last night in my social work evaluation class, and we talked a lot about how you write and how you phrase and what language you use really can impact, from an ethical perspective, can impact the outcome of your evaluation and how it's perceived by the funders, the constituents, the taxpayers, by everyone.
So the choice of language that you use will influence the audience that you are seeking to persuade. Can you tell I teach rhetoric? I can't turn it off. And that tone also sets like the ethical implications for the things that you say. Excellent. Christina, you had your hand up.
Well, I was going to say, I always talk to my students about the importance of, yes, thinking about what your agenda is, who your audience is, what your voice is, but also what are the perspectives and voices that you're not focused on, you're not including, either consciously or unconsciously. That's something that you want to calibrate with your writing and research, or if not, maybe acknowledge that. If you understand that you're doing one thing and not everything.
So Christina had mentioned kind of the ethics of inclusion and whether we are consciously or unconsciously omitting specific perspectives and what the ethical impact is when we do that on purpose or on accident. Carol?
In the context of a classroom, I was talking to my students about why they should cite their sources to their business students. So it was to lend credibility to their own arguments, but to give people credit for the great ideas that they had.
Yeah, absolutely. So the practice of ethical citation makes sure that we're respecting the intellectual property of others while also creating our own credibility while we're writing. I think that's good to get us started. If anybody online wants to chime in, I'm happy to try to check the chat as we go, and I can add that in. So I think it's important when you are trying to get your students to really grasp onto an idea to introduce it early in the semester. That's why I have my research librarian come in within the first week or two, because I'm like, you need to know about this incredible resource. And if they don't show up until week like 6 or 7, my students are just like, okay, I guess this is here for a week. No, we have to start early and then we have to repeat that exposure throughout the semester. So I ask my students to read a very accessible short article published in the New York Times called How to Use Chat GPT and Still Be a Good Person. And again, it was a short read. For students who may or may not have remembered that they had homework, it only took me about 10 minutes at the beginning of class to give them time to, just review their notes, to make sure we were all up to date and ready to have this conversation. And so we started the conversation with making a list about ed tech, education technology, websites that exist that can offer aid to students who are in academic situations. So to break the ice, I introduced EasyBib because to me, that is like my students' most favorite website that's ever existed. It takes all of the guesswork out of making citations. They're often not right, but it's easier than having to do it themselves. So we started with EasyBib. And then let me tell you the education I received yesterday in like math help. I had no idea. So there's a website or an app called PhotoMath where you can take a photo of your math homework and it will like show you how to complete the problem. There's a math website called Desmos that does something similar. There are websites that exist exclusively for calculus homework, which I obviously never had to learn about because I never made it to calc. I barely made it through college algebra. And then statistics. We talked about ChatGPT, we talked about Chegg and Quizlet and Course Hero, and these websites that exist, some of them for a fee, that will give you access to what could be study materials or what could be entire answers to questions that you might find on a quiz. It reminded me of a conversation that I had with Cole Huber a few years ago from the Department of Biology, who recognized the huge issue that Chegg was creating for biology instructors when all of their test questions, all 150 of them out of their shared bank, had found their way onto Chegg. So ed tech is pervasive and our students know about it. It's not this like dirty secret where we're like, well, hopefully they just don't know and that way we won't have to worry about them using it. They're using it. They know all about it. They know more than we do. So I learned a lot yesterday. Here I was thinking that I was going to be like, look at all this stuff that's available. And I learned way more than I think I taught them about ed tech. So that started our conversation. I broke them into small groups of 3 or 4 and asked them to make a very simple pros and cons list. That's all we did. And I said, what are some benefits that we might get from utilizing ed tech versus what are some of the things, the trade-offs, the costs, what are the things that we lose? What are the things that we give up when we rely on ed tech? And I want to be very clear with you guys and with my students. This is how I started the conversation. We have roles in this conversation. You are aware of your audience. I am aware of mine. You are students. I am a teacher. There are answers you know I want to hear. And to be clear, yes, I do want to hear them. But I also want to humanize decision-making. And the way that that's really the decision, that's really the part of impact where ed tech becomes more and more tempting for our students to use and become reliant on. So that was the purpose of this conversation, was to kind of humanize that moment where we find ourselves between, I can do this the hard way, or I can take anything from a light assist to a complete control over my work. In conclusion of that conversation, as soon as we got to the consequences list, when plagiarism inevitably ended up on our list, some of them by simply calling it getting caught, we brought it back to plagiarism, and the ethics of that, we found ourselves in a conversation about the ethics of ed tech, about the ethics of completing our own work. And that segued perfectly into introducing the DFEI principles. I asked students to read through the 8 with their very brief explanations, which you will see up here on the board. And I simply asked them to connect decision-making about our use of ed tech to these principles. And students very obviously, whether they knew who their audience was or not, if they truly believed this, jury's still out on that one, they were able to very clearly see that if we decided that these principles were worthwhile, if we decided that these principles could somehow be guiding in some way, this might help us in those decision-making moments. And then I reminded them, it's very easy week 2 of semester when we're all rested and bright-eyed and we're not like sad yet, semester is still shiny, that it's really easy to stand on our moral high ground today. But week 9, when we're tired, it's a little bit easier in the spring because at least spring break is like in our sights, but in fall semester, when it doesn't feel like we get a break until week 14, we just got over having a cold. We haven't been to class in 3 days. We've fallen behind in all of our classes. We haven't seen our family or friends in a few days. Now, all of a sudden, we're in that moment. And we're in that position where we're like, I just need to get back on track. I just need to get out of this hole that I have found myself in because I fell a little bit behind. And those are the actual moments of decision-making where it matters for us to think about the choices that we have with ed tech and the integrity of our work. And then at the very end of all of this, I just offered some additional resources. I reiterated that office hours exist and that I'm delighted to talk to them during any of those. I reminded them that things like the Writing Center exists, all of the Excel centers across campus. It's usually specific to the Writing Center when they're in my class. And then this semester, I'm trying something called research small groups that puts them into small research cohorts of just their peers so they can vent about how much they hate me in my class without me having to listen to how much they hate me in my class. It's community building, right? And that those can act as resources. So here are some results, some takeaways from yesterday. They're not super clear, but on the right side, you'll be able to see just some pictures I took of the board when we got done with the pros cons lists. And so it seemed to me that there were three main takeaways that I took from that conversation that I think are worth sharing with this group. And the first was that grades create pressure. And it was like this really obvious thing that we could all acknowledge that this is true no matter what class we're in, especially if we are like aspiring nursing students. If we want to go to graduate school one day, we know how important the value of that GPA is. So we recognize that grades create a pressure, and it was just something that we could acknowledge. I have very little control over doing anything about that issue, but I could at least acknowledge that that is absolutely a truth. When we looked at our pros versus cons lists side by side. Okay. Nope, just kidding. When we looked at our pros and cons list side by side, we realized that everything in the pros list was a short-term advantage. It was like immediate gratification. It was like the mouse that gets the cookie if it does the thing in the test. There was immediate gratification, there was immediate benefit. But if we looked at everything in the cons list, that's when we fell into more long-term consequences. That's where we recognize that like, this is what we give up in the long term. This is the long game. And it's really difficult for us to compare those short-term immediate gratification benefits to those long-term slow burn, later down the road consequences when we're in that moment of decision making. Okay, my third point. That I was actually really impressed by this, that before I had actually introduced the DFEI principles, students had brought up these terms on their own. Like they recognized there was issues with integrity, they recognized there was issues with accountability, and they recognized there was issues with trust. And the big trust issue was that they thought that their professors would stop trusting them. And I thought that was interesting because I guess, I don't know why, but in my mind, I was like, they don't care. Like, they're just doing the thing. Our opinion of their work matters very much to them. So it was really encouraging to hear that students wanted to feel trusted by their instructors. Again, we can totally like recognize a constraint. Students know exactly who they're talking to. And maybe if I had left the room, the conversation would have been a little bit different. But I felt like at the end, we had kind of reached this really interesting place to kind of start the semester from. They asked me some really good questions that I didn't have answers to, like, is it plagiarism if a bot writes it? Because it's not a person. I didn't steal another person's work. And I was like, I'm going to get back to you on that. Because everything in my soul and my bones says yes, but I don't have the legalese to prove it yet. But I'm going to find it, and I'll get back to you on that. So I guess this is also a way to plug all of the really interesting conversations that are happening around campus right now on this topic, that have been happening on campus around this topic. I know that in our very hallway, there are people who have been thinking about this idea. So maybe just keep an eye out on this. And then if this is something of interest, look for some of those events across campus that we can engage in the future. Oh, we're cooking with gas now. So just a quick reminder, especially if stasis theory is a particularly new concept for you. This is the framework through which we teach all English 1410 classes, which is helpful for those who teach students who arrive to you after having taken English 1410, that you just have a quick understanding of this is how we kind of teach their research process. So the levels of stasis have to build upon themselves. You can't just skip straight to level 4. You have to establish level 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. So in the first level, we have arguments of conjecture, category, and definition. First, we have to establish that a problem actually exists, and then we have to be able to define it and then perhaps categorize it. When we get to arguments of cause and consequence, we need to understand how did this happen, or how is this happening? What is contributing to the causes? And then what are some of those consequences? What is happening as an effect of this problem or situation? When we get to the third level of stasis, we're talking about arguments of value and evaluation. I'm going to offend Andrea very much when I simplify it to mean, is it good, bad, right, or wrong? It's so much more than that, and you should read her chapter to know that. But that's kind of how I boil it down very simply. And as you can tell, if we're asking those questions, we're thinking about the ethical implications of an argument. So the DFEI principles just really complement this level of stasis more than ever. And then conveniently, when we get to the end, we're looking at arguments of proposal, policy, and procedure. And by the time we get there, we should really readily be thinking about stakeholders. We should be thinking about who is impacted by this research, by this problem. so that by the time we get to making recommendations, we are well aware that we are making recommendations for more than just one person or one group of people. We're making recommendations that are going to have an impact much wider than that, which is another reason why thinking about research ethically is so important when we get to that point. So here's where I start quoting Andrea. Phase 2 is to reintroduce the DFEI principles when we get to the third level of stasis. So yet to be done, students will have read the chapter and completed a quick stasis guide just to make sure they've taken good notes on the information in that chapter. And then in class, we are going to talk about a company called costplusdrugs.com. If you're unfamiliar with it, Elon Musk worked with a doctor who cold call emailed him and said, hey, the healthcare system's a mess. And I think there's a real business opportunity to provide generic pharmaceuticals at a lower cost. Did I say Elon Musk? I meant Mark Cuban. I'm so sorry, Mark Cuban. Elon Musk would not be doing work like this. I don't have a lot of sympathy for billionaires, but at least Mark Cuban's like trying to do a good thing. So Mark Cuban started this facility in Dallas. And what they offer is the exact cost of drugs that they get from the manufacturer with a 15% markup, just to make sure that they can cover overhead and operations, and then a $5 shipping fee. This has changed lives across the United States. It has offered necessary generic pharmaceuticals that had cost somewhere in the hundreds, now available at a fraction of that cost. Some complaints against it is that because it's still new and it's offered in up to 400 pharmaceuticals, there's still a lot that they're not available. Like they don't have EpiPens yet. They're still working on getting access to some of the pharmaceuticals or drugs that a lot of people are seeking. So we're going to talk about cost plus drugs. And I have a 6-minute PBS interview that I will not play for you to kind of get the conversation started. And I'm going to split the room into 2. And half of the room is going to read an article that's kind of like praising Cuban for everything that he's doing. And the other half are going to read an article that's kind of criticizing or pulling out some of the faults, so that we can kind of look at this from a more generalized perspective without turning it into a mini research project of its own. And then from that, I'll ask students these questions that come directly from the textbook. What is the quality or value of the thing, action, event, or entity? Is it ethical? Is the entity behaving ethically? And in that conversation, I assume that we will think about, is costplusdrugs.com acting ethically versus how is the rest of the pharmaceutical industry acting? And if the answer is that there's something unethical about the massive profits that come out of pharmaceuticals, does that prove, if Cuban is successful, that we can still do business ethically and profitably without jeopardizing necessary stakeholders who are relying on these medications? How good or bad is it? Will it bring about good or bad consequences? I said correspondence, maybe both of those things. So this will kind of get us started that day. So that'll be kind of day 1 for that week. And then day 2 going into Thursday, we're going to break that down just a little bit further. And this is a further line of questioning that Andrea provides in that chapter later on, where she asks a series of 7 questions. I trust that you can read these. I'm also happy to share the slides at the end of this. And then I'm simply going to add on this 8th question for them to consider. What DFEI principles are present in the argument? So after we've kind of read these articles in class, I'm going to have them go home, read the article again on their own. Maybe I'll switch it up. So like if you were the group in class that looked at the criticism, maybe this time for homework, you'll look at the article that praises. I haven't made that decision yet. Have them read it again, fill out these more thorough questions here at the end, and then we'll come back to figure out what DFEI principles are present here. All of this is meant to give them practice in how they're evaluating the arguments that they are including in their own research. So if they can get in the habit of looking at relatively simple, popular articles written on a topic and do this kind of evaluation of the, is it good, bad, right, or wrong? Do we find ourselves in a position of where this is ethical or unethical? The chapter that they'll read will ask them to think about the criteria that are required for us to consider if something is good or bad, and then to weight that criteria appropriately. So we'll have a conversation when we come back to class on Thursday that accomplishes those things. And then hopefully that kind of sets them up with the mindset to be able to go forward and do those things in their own research as they're looking at the sources that support their own argument. Day 3. It's a very long week and a half. This is when we're going to do a stakeholder analysis. So now that we've thought about this argument through and through, I want to think about who's impacted. Who are these different groups? Who are these different individuals that seem to be most impacted by the existence of this company, by its consequences? And so as an entire team, as a whole class, we'll come up with labeling each of those stakeholder groups. The owners, the pharmaceutical providers who sell directly to Cuban's business, the pharmaceutical companies who compete directly with Cuban's business, the insurances that are still working out whether or not they want to work with Cuban's business. Last I heard, he hadn't quite cracked that code yet, but for the cost that he was able to offer most of these drugs, clients didn't really have to rely on insurance as much as they did when they were going through a normal pharmacy. We'll think about the patients who are reliant upon these drugs. We'll think about the patients who are reliant on prescriptions that are not yet available. We'll break it down into these different stakeholder groups. And then we'll think about the ethical implications for each of these groups. And that'll help us go beyond just saying, okay, it's good, bad, right, or wrong. Who is it good, bad, right, or wrong for? And then we'll weigh those criteria again. Is it okay that some of the pharmaceutical industry is losing out on some of their business? Is it concerning that some groups of patients are being serviced with the availability of drugs while others are still waiting? We can weigh all of those things out together, but that way we really move through the process of recognizing that arguments are not by themselves good or bad. The implications that they have on very real groups of people, those who have something to gain and who have something to lose, all of those contribute to the way that we determine whether an argument lives up to the DFEI principles, whether these arguments show us that the redders or the actors are operating with good ethical, with good faith, with good ethical implications. Okay, and then we get to phase 3. I have adopted the act of reflection into my classes, especially in research, because I don't have enough time to check in individually to see how each of my students are doing through their process. So this is the third or the last reflection that they'll do for me throughout the semester. And so I ask questions like, how's it going? How do you feel about your revision process? How confident do you feel going into your final argument? Are there things that you learned along the way that really surprised you? Did you find yourself fighting confirmation bias at any point? These are questions that kind of help me temperature gauge my students without having enough time to really check in individually with each of them. And so one of the questions that I've added in bold to this final reflection is including these DFEI principles. So bringing it in for a third time, one more at the end of the semester. Did you identify the DFEI principles in the arguments you found for your literature review? How do you plan to use them in your final argument? So reminding students that the principles are more than just how did you find them out in the wilds of the world? How are you also planning on holding yourself to those standards as you are now responsible for writing your final argument, a stance that they will take now that they are well informed from their research in a level of stasis that they're choosing. And this does two things. It helps me kind of temperature gauge, and it puts it in their mind before they start writing that final research argument. How am I going to make sure that I'm acting with integrity, accountability, trust, respect, rule of law? How am I going to honor those things in the work that I contribute out to the world? And that's it. I have one more slide to recognize Andrea's work. So thank you so much for coming this morning. Thank you for being here online. I would love to take these last 10-15 minutes just for any feedback, any questions, any recommendations that you have for me to clean up phases 2 and 3. But again, thank you guys so much for being here this morning. I'd like to read out some of the comments that showed up in the chat because I think they're really good. Sheldon Gaskell, a colleague of ours in first year writing, said, I am most concerned about students who value and commit to ethics in research and writing practices, and then are thrown into a world where those ethics are often sidelined. I wonder how they can be resilient through those transitional challenges, which is fair, right? We put them on this ethical pedestal while they're here and we ask them to think really ethically about the world. And then they turn on the news and they're like, hey, wait a minute, I don't really see this happening in the world around me. That's a really excellent point. Andrea said, for me, research and ethics are inextricable. I would question the degree to which we could rightfully call the endeavor research if not informed by ethical principles that drive the process as a truth-finding endeavor, truth as in best truths for all stakeholders. Like I said, Andrea, she's just so good at this. So recognizing to her that these are not separate entities, that research writing and ethics have to coexist. I don't think it's possible for research writing to exist without ethics. So thank you so much to Andrea and Sheldon for offering those really insightful comments. Carol.
When I look at what my students write, they don't know how to use and to cite and to, sorry, I'm on the cite thing. But they don't actually know how to summarize ideas in a way that they'll go up a level and take main points, and maybe they'll throw in a direct citation. There's some kind of and I don't know how to help them get there.
Yeah.
Like individually I do, but they want to rewrite every sentence of something and call that
Their own. Yeah. The library actually just hosted this really incredible professional development for us a few months ago. What is time? And they cited the citation project. I don't know if you've ever looked at that. It's enlightening and horrifying all at the same time. We learned that something like 70% of direct quotes come from the first page of a scholarly article. Oh my God. But they talked a lot about the art of summary and how I think this is going to be me being super transparent for a second as I sat there feeling so guilty that we don't focus enough on teaching summary. We just assume this is a skill that they know how to do. We know how to summarize, you know how to like pull out main ideas. I don't know that we've taken enough time to really to show our students how to do that and why it's valuable. And so I'm actually changing one of my assignments this semester to make it that no, you have to practice summary in this or you're not going to be able to get through the rest of this research very well. And then citations are tricky. I talk about this a lot with my students when we talk about paraphrasing information, because paraphrasing is like a lot of work, right? Like you take somebody else's original idea, you have to completely change the language to put it in your own. You have to change the sentence structure. And after you've done all of that, you're like, but I'm the one that just did all of that work. And so it's the reminder that you did do all of that work. You did the thing. Those were still somebody else's ideas in the first place. So while you have done that hard work of paraphrasing information, the information you paraphrased wasn't yours to begin with. And that's where the recognition of intellectual property and those conversations about the importance of citation really take off. And I think it's really important that students hear this from more than just their first year teachers. And I completely respect that in every other discipline, you guys are like, okay, they passed 1310, 1410, they've been inoculated from all of those bad habits that we get in writing. And now we have time to teach them the discipline that they are now taking this class in. And I get that and I respect that, but man, it's like this thing that we have to continually remind them of. These things don't stop being important once you get out of 1410. You didn't prove that you could do this and now you can just go back to the ways of citing the first 3 popular articles that pop up on Google as your research. We can't get away with simply reading an abstract and saying that oh, well, I once read this scholarly article that said all of these things. And the act of paraphrase is so difficult that I get why students are like, but I did all this work and now it's mine, reminding them that that's not quite how this works. Yeah, it's such a tricky thing to
try it with one article in the discussion board format. They have to summarize one article, put the link, and comment on someone else's and advance the conversation. But every semester, up until the end of the semester, I had a hell of a time trying to get them. And if I'm really honest about this, sometimes it gets a little fuzzy for me too.
Sure. Maybe that's part of where we need to be more transparent with our students. I don't like paraphrasing either.
Yeah.
It's hard. There's a lot of work involved. And I know its value. I know why we do it, but I'm not having any more fun than they are when I have to do it myself. maybe that's part of it. We just have to also tell them that like, we're human too. Like this is also like begrudging work for us, but we know the value of making sure that that intellectual property is honored and respected moving forward. Christina, you had your hand up.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think, one thing that came up on the citation thing that I always tell my students is, it's not that I'm gonna think that you're not doing the work in citing. I'm gonna know that you're doing a lot of work if you're citing a lot of other sources, because that's actually the assignment, you know? And I know you're not just gonna understand and come up with this stuff on your own. But that has to be contrasted with the summarizing information, which is what are you taking out of this, right? I think it's the barrier right now for me in history is the reading. This generation does not read the same way, particularly academic texts. I don't think they have the same type of practice and resiliency to push through and read these long monographs. I mean, the amount of reading that science started here, like, well, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And now I'm like, I think I have to do what they're doing in high school with my daughters, which is they read Shakespeare out loud as a class, you know, and they read, and that's how they work through the text, and then they do the takeaway. I mean, I'm not going to go there, but I'm just trying to figure out how do I get them to, you know, do summary when they're struggling so hard with reading. And I'm talking about like a 200-page book or maybe a 60-page chapter. You know, they're not getting past like the first. And
I complained.
So I mean, the Stasis all of those levels. I can't even get them to get one idea or one argument and then layering arguments and thinking about it, and balancing it becomes trickier because they're stuck maybe at level one almost.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you're trying to build research, not just think about it as individual articles.
Oh, right.
So I think less of a question, more of a comment, that the little summary that you just gave about being honest with our students about where we are and that we are human and that we are working at these issues with citation really also applies to the ethics question that you mentioned before. In social work, we have to do that all the time. But it's easy to forget that ethics are a very foundational part of our profession or any work that we do, like you said, when we look at TV or, you know, around us in the world and ethical decision making is not happening. Or it's gone by the wayside, right? Like people claim that they are ethical or that they make ethical decisions, and then you see the examples of when that did not happen. But that conversation about how it did or why it didn't happen, or why we value ethics, and then continue to keep that as an uppermost sort of goal, and only be improved upon if we acknowledge that we are always working at it the way that we described. So thank you for that.
And I wonder if there's also a way to acknowledge like ethics, like counterparts. Like, what does the opposite of ethics look like? What do things like corruption and greed do to like challenge ethics on a regular basis? And they don't have to be these like big scary things. They can just be like regular everyday decisions that normal human beings have to make. So it's not so black and white. So we recognize like, yes, these ethical decisions exist, but so do these things. And these things are real and they're tempting, or they're, you know, we see other people do them and it makes them feel more normalized. How do we balance those things? How do we hold ourselves accountable to the way that we want to like establish our own ethics? For sure.
The best ethical decision. It's not always going to be perfect, ever, right? Because we are human. Like you described. That's the power of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to just read out loud something real quick that Andrea had included in the chat. She said, in that way, to some extent, they make it theirs. I think we're talking about citation and paraphrase. They still have to cite the paraphrase though, exclamation mark. But I emphasize that they are present in subtle ways in the decisions that they make about what sources to choose and the decisions they make about how to put them in conversation. That in itself is an ethical obligation. They must be attentive to how they represent what is happening in the conversation. Are the scholars, they are representing opposing one another or agreeing to a point and then diverging? Like being able to map how that conversation, how it trails, how it follows, how it borrows ideas from others, how it recognizes the ideas of others while making their own. We see this in professionally published writing. Now we're trying to get our students to recognize that these are acts that they want to emulate themselves.
That's pretty subtle. Like where they
Yeah.
emerge. That as soon as they understand the assumption behind the original argument is. It's tricky. Maybe for your master's students. Everybody's tricky.
And to Christina's point, it means that you have to have read far enough back in the citation map to understand, here's where the original arguments come from in the first place, to understand where those divergences appear.
Put out the tree of knowledge kind of thing.
But it's true, like that, it may be subtle, but it's also empowering, right? And unless we point it out, it doesn't feel very empowering. Like we just don't go that far enough to recognize it. So it might be, again, like by calling it out, a way to involve students more in their learning and embrace what we're trying to onto them, even just about citations, right?
Maybe we show them one branch, one root system.
I also feel like maybe it's because of social media, but there's a lot of pressure to be like the first to do something, to create like something that's brand new and original. And that's not how academia is. Like every once in a while we get something that really feels like a wrench in the system, but all ideas kind of get this like history, and we trace back to the ways that we're influenced by the things that we read, and we're inspired by different perspectives that really change us. Nobody gets to walk into a room and start talking about the banking concept of education like they made it up and not recognize free air. Like you just don't get to like, I'm going to flip tables over and turn academia on its head and not recognize that like there were people exiled from their home countries that have already done this. We are following in the footsteps. And I think there's this like pressure of like, have to be novel, have to be unique, have to do something that nobody else is doing. And maybe that comes over to academia, like they feel like they have to present and create something that's brand new. The divergences are what give us opportunities to create something new.
You can't create something new unless you understand what exists.
Yeah.
So
Level 1 of stasis. We got to be able to define what's going on. We're about 5 minutes over on when we're supposed to do the presentation, so I'm good if you guys are good. Thank you guys so much for being here and for the conversation that follows. I'm really grateful, Carol, that you brought up citation because it's obviously so important in this, and I considered adding it, but then it just kind of feels like I am the broken record of research writing where I'm like, and now we get to phase 4, which is pressing citation, super hard. I feel like that's just embedded throughout the entire class, but it's definitely a conversation that is so deeply involved in ethics that it definitely deserves to be like a part of the way that maybe those DFEI principles can also be connected to the decisions that we make about how we cite information, where we seek sources, how much value and credibility we recognize exist in sources based on the ethical principles of their authors or on their intention. I think all of that really speaks highly to just a fourth dimension of how these principles can help students think about the research process and their own obligation to it.
So thank you all for joining us online. Thank you for everybody who's in person. Feel free to grab more food before you leave. And again, thanks to all of you online, and especially putting up with our technical difficulties this morning.